The vessel departed from an unknown point on the Norwegian coast and has not been accounted for. The crew is believed to consist of Norwegian nationals. The cargo has not been determined. The vessel is presumed to have reached British-controlled waters. This is the language of a German naval district report, filed in November 1942 by the Kriegsmarine Command responsible for the coast of Western Norway. It is a document that says very little and means a great deal. The vessel it describes is a fishing boat, an ordinary Norwegian motor-driven cutter of the kind that work the herring grounds off the Moor coast every autumn, carrying men who wore the same oil-stained jerseys and rubber boots and weathered faces as every other fisherman on the Norwegian coast. What it carries, in addition to the men who crew it, is a cargo the German Naval Command does not know and cannot determine. Weapons, radio equipment, printing supplies, medicines, sometimes agents of the British Special Operations Executive making the crossing from Shetland in darkness, sometimes Norwegian refugees making the same crossing in the other direction. The vessel has, in the language of the German report, not been accounted for. This is the polite formulation for an institutional admission that a boat left Norway and arrived in Britain, and the entire apparatus of German coastal surveillance, the patrol vessels and the Focke-Wulf reconnaissance aircraft and the harbour watch agents and the coastal radar stations failed to stop it. What the Germans called it in their internal documents varied with the period and the level of command. Early reports use the phrase fishermen's traffic, Fischereiverkehr, which is the bureaucratic euphemism for a phenomenon that German coastal security understands is happening but cannot precisely quantify. Later reports, as the scale of the operation becomes clearer through the accumulation of evidence, use harder language: organized resistance transport, hostile courier service, enemy infiltration route. By 1942, the files of the German security service in Norway, the Sicherheitspolizei and its attached SD, contained dozens of entries relating to vessels that departed Western Norway toward the open sea and vanished. Some are recovered as wrecks, occasionally with bodies, when the North Sea gives them back. Some are captured by German coastal patrol. Most are simply gone, present in Norwegian waters one night, absent the next morning, the crew and cargo and purpose unknown to the German authorities who filed the report and who will continue filing similar reports until the end of the occupation. The British called it the Shetland Bus. The name comes from the regularity of the service and the mundane reliability implied by that regularity. It runs as scheduled, regardless of weather, regardless of what the Germans put in its way, with the specific dependability of a public transport system operating in a theatre of war. From the autumn of 1941 through the spring of 1945, the Shetland Bus makes approximately 210 crossings of the North Sea between the Shetland Islands and the Norwegian coast, a distance of roughly 350 to 500 kilometers depending on the Norwegian landing point. It carries approximately 450 tons of supplies to the Norwegian resistance: weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio equipment, uniforms, food, medical supplies, propaganda materials for underground newspapers, printing presses small enough to fit in a fishing boat's hold. It delivers roughly 60 agents into German-occupied Norway. It evacuates over 300 Norwegian refugees, including Jewish families fleeing deportation, resistance members whose covers have been blown and who will be killed if they remain, and men of military age who intend to reach Britain and join the Norwegian forces fighting on the Allied side. It does all of this in some of the worst open water in the Northern Hemisphere, in vessels never designed for ocean passages, crewed by Norwegian fishermen who are not soldiers, but who do what they do with a steadiness that several British officers who worked with them describe as the most complete personal courage they encountered in 5 years of war. The German failure to stop it is the central paradox of the operation, and it is the paradox that the German documents circle around without ever quite resolving. The resources the Wehrmacht brings to coastal security in Norway are considerable. The Kriegsmarine maintains a substantial force of patrol and escort vessels along the Norwegian coast. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf FW. 200 maritime reconnaissance aircraft fly regular sweeps over the North Sea. German radar stations installed on the Norwegian coast from 1942 onward cover significant arcs of the approaches. The Gestapo and SD have networks of agents and informers in the Norwegian fishing communities, supplemented by the surveillance apparatus of the Reichskommissariat Nord under Josef Terboven. The German coastal defense system is not the product of negligence or indifference. It is a considered and resourced attempt to control the maritime approaches to an occupied country, and it fails repeatedly and consistently to stop boats that are visible on radar, that carry recognizable human beings, and that depart from ports and anchorages that are in German-controlled territory. It fails because the North Sea is the North Sea. The North Sea in winter is among the most dangerous navigable water in the world. Between November and April, it produces weather of a violence and unpredictability that makes sustained patrol operations extraordinarily difficult for vessels of any size. Gales of force 8 or 9 are common. Force 11 is not rare. The waves in the open sea between Shetland and Norway can run to 8 or 10 meters in sustained storm conditions, short and steep and irregular in the way that shallow water with a long wind fetch produces, the kind of sea that exhausts a crew within hours and that disables patrol vessels with mechanical failures caused by the continuous pounding. German coastal patrol boats, which are designed for harbour defence and coastal convoy escort in the confined waters of the Norwegian fjords and island channels, are poorly suited to the open sea conditions between the coast and Shetland. The weather that makes the North Sea crossing dangerous for a Norwegian fishing cutter makes it equally dangerous, or more so, for the German patrol craft that might intercept it. And in the worst weather, the conditions under which the Shetland Bus chose most often to sail, because the worst weather offered the best cover, German patrol operations were simply suspended. The aircraft that could potentially spot a vessel in the open sea were unable to fly in the conditions that the Shetland Bus captains preferred. The radar that could detect a surface contact at range could not distinguish a fishing boat from the returns produced by storm-driven wave crests at the ranges involved. The North Sea, which is the enemy of any mariner who crosses it in winter, is in this specific operational context the ally of the men who cross it in fishing boats from Shetland to Norway and back. Leif Andreas Larsen is the man most completely identified with the Shetland Bus, and the identification is earned. He is 28 years old when he makes his first crossing in 1941, a native of Bergen, the son of a ship's captain, a man who has been at sea since his youth and who holds a mate's certificate and has already demonstrated in the first months of the occupation a willingness to take risks that most of his contemporaries would not consider. His first crossing is in a vessel called the Fasan, a 47-foot motor cutter carrying a load of weapons and an SOE agent named Martin Linge, who is returning to Norway to organize resistance activity. The crossing takes 35 hours, mostly in weather that would have kept a Norwegian fisherman with anything to lose in harbour. Larsen brings the Fasan into a pre-arranged anchorage on the Sunnmøre coast in darkness, puts Linge ashore with his equipment, collects the passengers waiting there and brings the boat back to Shetland. The operation goes as planned. Nobody who was not supposed to know about it learns about it. Over the next 4 years, Larsen makes 52 crossings. This is not a number that has a comparable figure in any other clandestine maritime operation of the Second World War. 52 crossings of the North Sea in winter in fishing boats into a coastal defense system that by 1942 includes radar and aircraft patrols and harbor agents and informer networks, and that is actively hunting for precisely the kind of operation Larsen is running. He is awarded the Distinguished Service Order twice, the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal and the Norwegian War Cross twice, among other decorations. The British officers who assess his performance consistently reach for language that exceeds the normal vocabulary of military commendation. They do not describe him as brave in the ordinary sense. They describe him as something for which they have difficulty finding the right word. A man who has looked at the North Sea in November and at the German coastal defense system and at the physical characteristics of a 40-foot fishing boat and has concluded that the crossing is possible, and who has then made the crossing, and who has continued making it long after the accumulation of close calls and lost friends and damaged boats would have persuaded a rational person that the returns do not justify the risk. The German records track the Shetland Bus through the lens of failure. When a vessel is intercepted, the records document the capture with precision. The name of the patrol craft that made the interception, the position, the cargo recovered, the crew arrested. When a vessel makes its crossing successfully, the records document the absence. A departure observed by a harbour agent in Ålesund, or Floro, or one of the other small ports that the bus uses, a vessel moving west out of the territorial waters on a night when the weather is building, and then nothing. The German Coastal Command in Bergen receives these absence reports and files them in accumulating folders that, by the middle of 1942, represent a documentary record of an operation they understand is running, but cannot precisely identify, cannot reliably intercept, and cannot stop. The frustration visible in the language of the documents is the specific frustration of a bureaucratic institution confronting an operational phenomenon that does not fit the categories through which it normally understands the world. The German coastal defense system is designed to handle identifiable threats: submarines, aircraft, organized assault. It is not designed to handle an operation that looks, at every step, exactly like what it is pretending to be, which is ordinary Norwegian fishing. The cover is the operation's primary protection, and it is the cover that the Germans find most difficult to penetrate. The vessels used for the Shetland Bus are genuine Norwegian fishing cutters, indistinguishable from the thousands of similar vessels that work the Norwegian coast and that German coastal patrol sees every day. The crews are genuine Norwegian fishermen, whose clothing and equipment and vernacular and knowledge of the coastal waters is entirely authentic because it is authentic. The paperwork carried by the vessels, when they carry any, is Norwegian fishing documentation of the appropriate period and character. The fish, when a vessel carries fish as additional cover, is real fish from real Norwegian waters. A German coastal patrol boat encountering a Shetland Bus vessel in the territorial waters off the Norwegian coast encounters something that looks, sounds, smells, and presents documents as a Norwegian fishing boat, because in every practical sense, that is what it is. The only thing that distinguishes it from its cover is the cargo in the hold and the destination in the skipper's mind, and neither of those things is visible to a patrol boat hailing it in the coastal channel between the islands. This creates for the German security apparatus a specific and largely unresolvable problem. The solution to the cover problem is either to inspect every vessel in Norwegian coastal waters, which would require resources so enormous as to be practically impossible and would bring the Norwegian fishing industry to a halt, disrupting the food supply of the occupation in ways that would create political problems the German administration in Norway preferred not to have, or to identify the specific vessels and crews involved through informant intelligence, which requires informants with the right access and the right knowledge, which the German networks consistently fail to develop in the fishing communities where the Bus recruits its crews. The Shetland Bus operates in the social world of the Norwegian western coastal fishery, a community of men who have known each other for generations, whose families are connected by marriage and by the particular solidarity of people who live dangerous lives at sea, and whose resistance to German informant recruitment is, by every account, nearly absolute. German agents who attempt to penetrate this community encounter a social fabric that has no room for them and that, in several documented cases, provides the warning that gets a Shetland bus crew out of a harbour before the Gestapo arrives. The operations themselves are never comfortable and are sometimes catastrophic. The Shetland Bus loses 14 vessels during its operational life and 72 crew members. The losses cluster in the first 2 years when the operation is running wooden fishing cutters from the pre-war Norwegian fleet, vessels that are seaworthy in coastal conditions and that can make the North Sea crossing in reasonable weather, but that are pushed beyond their design parameters by the conditions and operational demands of a clandestine winter route. A vessel called the Blia is lost in a storm in November 1941. All hands. The Borghild is captured by German patrol in February 1942. The crew is arrested and most are executed. The Erviken runs into a German patrol in appalling weather in 1943 and is sunk with the loss of several crew members before the survivors can be rescued. Each loss reduces the pool of experienced crews, damages the morale of the operation, and presents the organizers in Shetland with the task of finding replacement vessels and men for an operation that the German security system is actively trying to destroy. The response, which arrives in late 1943 when the American Office of Strategic Services joins the British in supporting the Shetland Bus, is a fleet replacement. 3 American submarine chasers, purpose-built steel vessels 3 times the size of the original fishing cutters, are transferred to Norwegian crew and begin operating the route from the winter of 1943 to 44 onward. The new vessels change the operational character of the bus entirely. Where the fishing cutters depended on weather, concealment, and the cover of legitimate Norwegian fishing to make their crossings, the submarine chasers depend on speed and firepower. At 20 knots, they can cross from Shetland to the Norwegian coast and back in a single night, spending as little time as possible in the danger zone of German-controlled waters. They carry guns sufficient to fight a patrol boat if intercepted. They are designed not for concealment but for speed, and the combination of speed and armament and the accumulated Norwegian expertise in navigating the coastal approaches in darkness and bad weather makes them, for the last 18 months of the war, effectively unstoppable. The German Coastal Command's files for this period record an escalating sequence of reports about fast, unidentified vessels transiting the coastal waters at night that cannot be engaged before they are gone. The cargo that the Shetland Bus carries into Norway is worth describing in some detail because it is the cargo, rather than the romantic image of the operation, that reveals its strategic significance. The weapons it delivers supply the Norwegian resistance units that will, by the final months of the occupation, have armed approximately 40,000 men. These units do not fight pitched battles against German forces during the occupation itself. The Norwegian Resistance Command in exile, in coordination with British strategic direction, makes the correct assessment that premature uprising would result in German reprisals that the civilian population would bear, and that the armed resistance units should preserve their strength for the moment of liberation. But the knowledge that these units exist, armed and trained and distributed through the Norwegian countryside and mountains, is a factor in German strategic planning throughout the occupation. The 400,000 German troops in Norway that another video in this channel has examined at length are partly there because of the threat that these armed resistance units represent. The cost of maintaining that garrison, in resources diverted from other fronts, in strategic distraction imposed on the German command, in the political and economic burden of occupation, is a cost that the Shetland Bus materially contributed to imposing. The radio equipment it delivers is of comparable strategic importance. Norwegian resistance radio operators, equipped with sets brought in by the bus, provide the British with intelligence on German naval movements, on convoy schedules, on the positions of major warships including the Tirpitz, on coastal defences, on weather conditions, on troop movements. The intelligence flowing from Norwegian resistance radio operators through the Shetland Bus network is, by several assessments of officers in the Special Operations Executive who handled it, among the most consistently reliable and operationally significant intelligence produced by any resistance network in occupied Europe. The Norwegian geography, with its long coastline and its fjords that served as anchorages for German surface units, made Norway one of the most intelligence-rich environments in the occupation, and the Shetland Bus was the artery that connected Norwegian observers with British intelligence consumers. The printing supplies it carries feed an underground press that, by the middle of the occupation, is producing clandestine newspapers with a combined circulation, historians estimate, of over 150,000 copies per issue. These newspapers maintain the connection between the Norwegian population and accurate information about the course of the war, in a media environment that the German occupation has otherwise thoroughly controlled. Norwegian state radio has been captured, Norwegian newspapers have been placed under censorship. The publication of materials critical of the occupation is punishable by death. Against this controlled information landscape, the underground newspapers represent the primary channel through which the Norwegian population receives information that corresponds to what is actually happening in the war, as opposed to what the German administration wants them to believe is happening. The resistance press is not a military capability. It is a psychological one, maintaining the sense of connection and solidarity and ultimate hope that sustained a population through 5 years of occupation and that the German administration recognized as an active threat to the stability of the occupation. Obersturmführer Kurt Stagg, the Gestapo officer responsible for counterintelligence operations against the Norwegian resistance network in the Sunnmøre district from 1942 to 1944, kept a working diary that portions of survived the war and were examined by Norwegian police authorities and later by historians. Stagg is 31 years old at the time of his assignment to Norway, a career Sikkerhetspoliti officer with previous service in Poland, methodical and humorless, and by his own account genuinely puzzled by the problem the Shetland Bus presents to his investigative methods. His diary entries on the subject of coastal infiltration read as a sustained and increasingly frustrated meditation on the failure of conventional intelligence techniques in a maritime environment. "We know that transport exists," he writes in July 1943. "We know approximately where the vessels depart from the Norwegian coast. We know approximately what they carry. We do not know who the crews are, where they are recruited, how the cargo is distributed after arrival, or how to insert an agent into the network. The fishing community on this coast is closed against us in a way I have not previously encountered. The men know each other from birth. There is no vacancy into which a new man can be placed." Stagg's frustration is that of a man whose professional instrument is the penetration of social networks, who has found a social network that, by the particular character of its formation, a community of seafarers with generational ties bound by the shared danger of the sea before the shared danger of the occupation, is impenetrable by the techniques he has available. He eventually achieves partial success by a different route, not by placing an agent inside the fishing community, but by establishing surveillance of the inland distribution network through which the bus's cargo reaches resistance units in the interior. In late 1943 and early 1944, Stagg's operations roll up several resistance cells in the Sunnmøre region, arresting couriers and radio operators and making the connection between the coastal landing points and the organizational structure further inland. These arrests are significant for the specific cells they destroy and significant for the disruption they cause to specific operations. They do not stop the Shetland Bus, because the bus's operations are compartmented in a way that prevents the arrest of inland distributors from compromising the maritime crews. By the time Stagg is transferred from Norway in early 1944, the route continues to operate at full capacity. Leif Larsen survives the war. He returns to civilian life in Norway after the liberation in May 1945, and, unlike many veterans of clandestine operations who find the transition to peacetime difficult, appears to manage the transition with the same methodical composure that characterized his wartime operations. He works as a mariner for the rest of his professional life. He gives occasional interviews in which he discusses the Shetland Bus with the characteristic Norwegian restraint. factually, without dramatization, in the tone of a man describing a job that was difficult and that he did to the best of his ability, and that he is glad is over. He is asked in one interview conducted in the 1970s what he considers the most dangerous moment in his 52 crossings. He thinks about it for a while and names a specific incident in the winter of 1942 when a patrol boat came close enough in fog that he could hear German voices on deck before the fog thickened again and the patrol boat disappeared. He says he thought they were finished. He says the boat turned away and he was not sure why, whether the Germans had not seen them or had seen them and mistaken them for a legitimate fisherman. He says he was frightened in that moment in a way he had not been before or since. Then he returned to Shetland and unloaded, and the next week he sailed again. The North Sea receives each winter whatever is sent across it and gives back what it chooses to give back. The men of the Shetland Bus sent fishing boats across it for 4 years into German-occupied waters and out again, and the sea kept 72 of them and returned the rest, and the cargo they delivered kept a resistance alive and fed an intelligence service and maintained a connection between an occupied people and the outside world that the Germans understood as a threat and documented as a problem and never solved. What they wrote about it in their district reports and their Gestapo files and their operational assessments is the record of an institution trying to describe something it cannot stop in language designed for problems that have solutions. The vessel departed from an unknown point on the Norwegian coast and has not been accounted for. By the end, there were hundreds of such entries. The vessel is presumed to have reached British-controlled waters. Presumed. In the language of German bureaucracy, that word is a concession. It means we know what happened. We do not know how to stop it, and we do not expect to. The base of operations on the British side is a requisitioned house at Flemington, near Lerwick on the southern tip of Shetland mainland, which becomes the operational headquarters of what is officially designated the Norwegian Independent Company 1, and what everyone involved calls, without any particular formality, the Shetland Bus. The house is renamed Broch, an old Shetland word for a stone tower, and it serves as the planning centre, the signals room, the briefing room, and the domestic accommodation for the Norwegian crews between crossings. The officer who runs it for most of the operational period is a Scottish major named Leslie Mitchell, who by all accounts combines administrative competence with the specific temperament required to manage a group of independent Norwegian fishermen who are operating under military command, but who are, as individuals, accustomed to making their own decisions about when and how to take a boat to sea. Mitchell's correspondence with SOE headquarters in London reveals a man walking a constant line between the operational requirements of the organization that is funding and directing the mission and the human requirements of the men who are executing it. Men who are not soldiers and who do not respond to the command culture of a military institution, but who are, individually, doing something more dangerous than most soldiers are asked to do, and doing it for reasons that have nothing to do with military ambition or career advancement. They are doing it because Norway is occupied, and they are Norwegian, and the sea is the one thing they know how to use against the occupier. The organizational structure on the Norwegian side is the resistance network that the SOE has been building since 1940, and that, by 1942, consists of a series of regional organizations covering the western coast, from Stavanger in the south to Trondheim in the north. These organizations receive the cargo brought by the bus and distribute it: weapons to paramilitary units in the countryside, radio equipment to the signals networks that provide intelligence to London, printing supplies to the underground press, documents and money and medicines to the civilian resistance infrastructure. The distribution is handled by couriers, most of them young men and women who have been recruited through the personal networks of the regional organizers, who carry packages on bicycles and in prams and under stacks of firewood and in the false bottoms of shopping bags through towns and villages where German soldiers and Gestapo informers are a constant presence. The chain from the Shetland Bus's landing point on the Norwegian coast to the end user of the cargo it carries passes through half a dozen hands and covers, in some cases hundreds of kilometers, and at every stage it depends on human beings who have made the decision, in full knowledge of the consequences of exposure, to participate in something that the German occupation classifies as a capital offense. The exposure consequences are not theoretical. They are documented in German security records and in Norwegian post-war investigations with a specificity that makes the decision of every person in the chain, from the Shetland bus crew to the final courier, a decision made in the awareness that being caught means arrest, interrogation by the Gestapo, probable torture and execution or deportation to a concentration camp from which return was unlikely. The German security apparatus in Norway is not mild. Josef Terboven, the Reichskommissar, operates Norway as a territory to be controlled rather than a population to be administered, and his counterintelligence operations against the resistance are conducted with a brutality that becomes progressively more extreme as the occupation continues and as German confidence in the stability of the occupation erodes. The Shetland bus crews who are captured, several of the 14 lost vessels are captured rather than sunk by weather, are not treated as prisoners of war. They are treated as saboteurs. Most of them are shot. The knowledge of this is present in every decision made by every man who loads a boat at Flemington and points it east toward the Norwegian coast. The physical experience of the crossing deserves more attention than the operational history of the Shetland bus typically gives it, because it is the physical experience that most directly conveys what the men involved were actually asked to do. A Norwegian fishing cutter of the type used in the early years of the operation is a vessel of 40 to 60 feet, built of wood, powered by a diesel engine producing between 50 and 150 horsepower. Designed for the coastal and offshore fishing work of the Norwegian western coast. It is not designed for sustained open ocean passages in North Sea winter conditions. It rolls deeply and continuously in beam seas, a motion that exhausts the crew within hours. Its forward sections pound in head seas with an impact that loosens fittings and that, in prolonged heavy weather, can work the hull planking to the point of dangerous flexibility. It is cold, the wheelhouse is unheated or minimally heated, and the working deck is entirely exposed to the spray and the wind that turn every surface white with ice within hours of a gale. The crew sleeps in a cramped forward cabin in which 4 or 5 men occupy berths designed for 2, breathing diesel fumes and seawater condensation, waking every few hours to take watch in conditions that would have kept the boat in harbour if harbour were an option. The crossing takes, depending on the weather and the destination, between 18 and 40 hours in each direction. A crew that departs Flemington in the morning arrives on the Norwegian coast the following night, unloads and loads in darkness, and departs again, arriving back in Shetland after another overnight passage. The total operational duration of a round trip from departure to return is between 3 and 5 days, most of which is spent either at sea in the North Sea in winter or standing offshore in Norwegian coastal waters, waiting for darkness. The men who make these crossings do not do so for pay. The Norwegian government in exile provides a nominal wage, but no pay scale accounts for what the crossing actually costs in physical and psychological terms. They do it for reasons that they articulate in the accounts that survive, with a consistency that suggests the reasons are genuinely held rather than performed. Norway is occupied. Someone has to carry the weapons and the radio equipment and the agents across, and they have the seamanship to do it. That is the whole explanation. It does not require elaboration. The strategic legacy of the Shetland bus is distributed across several categories of consequence that resisted precise accounting during the war and that historians have been more willing to assess with precision in the decades since. The armed resistance units that the bus supplied did not, as noted, fight major battles during the occupation itself. They fought one battle of decisive significance, the liberation. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 and the occupation ended, the transition of authority in Norway from the German garrison to Norwegian civil and military authorities required, among other things, that the German garrison surrender to someone. The armed resistance units, now openly in the field with weapons supplied in significant part by the Shetland Bus, represented the local authority to whom that surrender was offered and accepted. The liberation of Norway was not, in the end, a military operation requiring Allied forces to fight their way in against a resisting German garrison. It was a political transition supported by the presence of armed Norwegian units on Norwegian soil who could enforce the terms of the surrender and prevent the specific disorder that transitions of this kind produce when there is no organized local authority to manage them. The Shetland Bus was, in this outcome, a material contributor to the specific character of the Norwegian liberation. The intelligence it carried out of Norway shaped operations elsewhere. The Tirpitz intelligence, which several Norwegian resistance radio operators contributed to over the years of her presence in Norwegian waters, informed the decisions about when and how to attack the battleship that another video in this channel has examined in detail. The convoy intelligence, detailing German shipping movements along the Norwegian coast, informed the submarine operations that the Royal Navy and later the American Navy conducted against German coastal traffic. The weather intelligence, produced by Norwegian observers on the coast and transmitted via the radio networks that the bus supplied, contributed to British meteorological assessments that affected the timing of operations across the Northern Theatre. The specific value of any single piece of intelligence is impossible to calculate with precision, but the cumulative contribution of a Norwegian intelligence network that the Shetland Bus made possible is, by the assessments of the historians who have examined the SOE archives and the intelligence records, significant beyond what the modest physical scale of the operation would suggest. The refugees it evacuated, the 340 by the count, most frequently cited by historians, include people whose presence in Britain contributed to the Norwegian war effort in ways that are worth noting. The men of military age who were brought out joined the Norwegian forces fighting with the British and participated in operations that included the Normandy landings and the liberation campaigns of 1944-45. The Jewish families who were evacuated in 1942 and 1943 as the German deportation program swept through the Norwegian Jewish community were among those who were not on the ships to Auschwitz and who survived the war. Approximately 770 Norwegian Jews were deported in 1942. Those who were not deported were those who were warned in time and who had a route to safety, and the Shetland Bus was one of the routes to safety that the Norwegian resistance maintained. The boats do not appear in the deportation records because they carried people away from the deportations rather than toward them. The absence is the evidence. Larsen's 52 crossings are, in the end, the single human fact that the Shetland Bus story keeps returning to, because 52 is a number that resists domestication. The first crossing is courageous. The 10th crossing is extraordinary. The 52nd crossing, after everything that Larsen has seen and lost and survived in the years between the first and the last, is something for which the vocabulary of courage and duty becomes inadequate. It is something more like a commitment that has been made, and that is honored without calculation of consequences, the way that some people honor commitments and most people cannot. Larsen does not describe it in those terms. He describes it as going to sea, which is what he has always done, which is what the men in his community have always done, which is what the sea asks of the people who live near it. The North Sea in November is what it is. You sail because the cargo is waiting and the resistance needs it and there is no one else to take it. You sail and you come back, or you do not come back, and if you come back you sail again. 52 times. The connection between the Shetland Bus and the broader clandestine war conducted by the Special Operations Executive in occupied Europe is worth establishing, because it places the operation in a context that illuminates why it worked in ways that many comparable operations did not. SOE operations in occupied Europe ran on a spectrum from highly successful to catastrophically compromised. The network in France, known as Prosper, was penetrated by German counterintelligence in 1943 and destroyed, leading to the arrest and execution of dozens of agents. The network in the Netherlands was penetrated even more thoroughly in what became known as the England Spiel or North Pole operation, in which German agents transmitted on captured British radio sets for over a year, feeding false intelligence to London and luring further agents into German hands. The Shetland Bus, by contrast, was never penetrated at the level of its maritime operations. The German security apparatus identified it, tracked it, published internal reports about it, and failed to stop it for 4 years. The difference between the Norwegian operation and the failed networks in France and the Netherlands is, in significant part, the difference between a network whose human foundation is a closed professional community with generational bonds and a network whose human foundation is recruited volunteers working in urban environments where German counterintelligence has more points of penetration. The fishing community of Western Norway is not impossible to penetrate. It proved, in practice, impossible to penetrate in the time available and with the methods the German security apparatus chose to apply. The German decision not to interdict the Norwegian fishing industry more aggressively is itself a strategic calculation worth examining. A policy of stopping and searching every vessel that left a Norwegian port would have, as the German administrative records acknowledge, shut down the Norwegian herring and cod fishery, which was providing food both for the Norwegian population and for export to Germany. The German occupation of Norway was not economically self-sustaining. The Norwegian economy was producing goods and services that the occupation required, and disrupting the fishing industry to catch Shetland bus vessels would have imposed an economic cost that the occupation administration was not willing to accept. This is the specific paradox of an occupation that depends on the economic output of the occupied country to sustain itself. The more thoroughly it controls the economic activity of the occupied population, the more it disrupts the activity that generates the value it is extracting. The Shetland Bus exploited this paradox by operating inside a sector of Norwegian economic life that the German administration could not afford to shut down, and that it therefore could not afford to inspect with the thoroughness that the security situation required. The fishing boats continued to move because Norway needed fish, Germany needed fish, and the Shetland Bus needed fishing boats. The specific voyages that produce the most operationally significant consequences are difficult to identify with precision, partly because the intelligence product of the radio networks the bus supplied was processed through channels that did not always leave clear records of the connection between specific cargo deliveries and specific intelligence outcomes. But historians examining the SOE archives and the signals intelligence records have identified several operations in which the connection is traceable. The bombing of the Norsk hydro heavy water plant at Vemork in February 1943, one of the most celebrated sabotage operations of the war, was preceded by months of intelligence collection by Norwegian resistance networks equipped with radio sets, brought in by the Shetland Bus. The agents who conducted the sabotage itself were inserted into Norway, partly through the same coastal networks that the bus maintained. The heavy water program that the Vemork sabotage delayed or disrupted was part of the German effort to develop nuclear technology, and the intelligence and logistics infrastructure that made the Vemork operation possible was, in part, the Shetland Bus and the resistance network it supplied. The chain of connection is long and indirect, but it is real. The men who died in the Shetland Bus operations are commemorated in Norway with a specificity that reflects the Norwegian culture of remembrance. There is a museum at Telavag, a fishing village that was destroyed by the Germans in reprisal for harboring Shetland Bus operations in April 1942, where the entire male population was deported to concentration camps and the village itself was burned to the ground. The museum documents not only the Telavag reprisal, but the broader history of the Shetland Bus, the vessels and the crews and the crossings and the losses. There is a memorial at Shetland itself, at Scalloway, where the vessels were based in the later years of the operation, which lists the names of the Norwegian crewmen who died in the North Sea making crossings that the German records describe, with the bureaucratic understatement of an institution that does not know how to document its own failure, as vessels that departed from the Norwegian coast and did not return. The Televaag reprisal of April 1942 is the sharpest expression of what the German security apparatus did when it could not stop the Shetland Bus directly. Unable to penetrate the maritime operation, unable to intercept the vessels on the sea, the German command in Norway responded to the discovery of a Shetland Bus contact point at Televaag by destroying the village as a demonstration of what would follow from such contact. 69 men were deported to Germany, most to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, from which 31 did not return. The village was burned, the boats were sunk, the livestock was killed. The reprisal was designed to deter Norwegian communities from harbouring or supporting the Shetland Bus operation by making the cost of doing so visible and immediate. In the specific and immediate sense, it succeeded. It destroyed a contact point and created fear in coastal communities. In the broader sense, it failed. The Shetland Bus continued, found new contact points, and the Norwegian resistance did not collapse in the face of collective punishment. The Germans had discovered, as occupying powers have discovered throughout history, that collective punishment intended to separate a resistance movement from its civilian support base is as likely to deepen the relationship between the resistance and the population as to sever it, because the punishment falls on people who have not done the thing being punished and who know it. The submarine chasers that replaced the fishing cutters in late 1943 deserve attention as a symbol of how the operation evolved from improvisation to something closer to a professional clandestine maritime force. The three vessels, named Hitra, Vigra and Hesse after Norwegian islands, were American-built Higgins-type submarine chasers of 110 feet, displacing approximately 80 tons and capable of 23 knots. They were not fishing boats and could not pretend to be fishing boats. They were clearly military vessels, and their use represented a complete change in the operation's tactical logic. The fishing cutter crossings had depended on concealment. Look like a fishing boat, sail in fishing boat weather, exploit the German inability to distinguish legitimate from clandestine maritime traffic. The submarine chaser crossings depended on speed and darkness. Cross at night, cover the distance before dawn, be back in Shetland before German air reconnaissance could operate. The two approaches represent the two fundamental options available to a clandestine maritime operator. Be invisible or be fast enough that being visible does not matter. The fishing cutters were invisible. The submarine chasers were fast. Both worked in the conditions for which each was designed, and the transition from one to the other tracks the evolution of the German coastal defense from a system that could potentially be evaded by concealment to a system that, radar-equipped and better organized, required speed rather than concealment to penetrate. Larsen commanded the Vigra for the last 18 months of the war and made crossings in her that were operationally different in character from the fishing cutter crossings but identical in purpose. Carry the cargo to Norway, bring the passengers back to Shetland, maintain the connection. His account of the Vigra crossings has a different quality from the fishing cutter accounts, faster, more tense in the specific way that speed creates tension, rather than the sustained tension of slow boats in bad weather, with the added dimension of the Vigra's armament as a factor that the fishing cutters never had. On one crossing in early 1944, the Vigra was intercepted by a German patrol vessel whose captain apparently took her for a fast British motor torpedo boat rather than a cargo vessel, and the resulting engagement lasted long enough for the Vigra to take a hit in the superstructure before disengaging at full speed and returning to Shetland. Larsen brought the vessel back, reported the damage, waited for repairs, and sailed again the following week. The German patrol vessel filed a report about an encounter with an unidentified fast vessel of British military type that returned fire and escaped at high speed. The Vigra and her cargo do not appear in the German record of the encounter because the German patrol captain does not know what he has engaged. By the spring of 1945, the Shetland Bus is running at full operational capacity and is beginning to prepare for the specific role it will play in the liberation. The weapons caches distributed through the Norwegian resistance network over 4 years are being organized for mobilization. The radio networks are transmitting at high frequency, coordinating the resistance units with the Norwegian government in exile in London. The German garrison in Norway, 400,000 men who have been waiting for an Allied invasion that never came, is receiving orders from Berlin that the war is ending and that surrender is approaching. The Shetland Bus makes its last operational crossing in the final days of the war, carrying supplies that will no longer be needed for resistance operations because the occupation is ending, and bringing back passengers who have been waiting in the Norwegian mountains for the moment they can return. The moment arrives on May 8, 1945. The occupation ends. The fishing boats come home. The names of the 72 men who died in the Shetland Bus operations are known. They appear in Norwegian memorial records and in the operational history compiled after the war by David Howarth, who served as an officer at the Shetland base and who wrote the account that remains the foundational text on the operation. The names are Norwegian names: Niels, Ingvald, Knut, Arne, Trygve, Harald, Birger, Per. Men from Bergen and Alisund and Florø, and the small coastal villages of the Sunnmøre and Nordmøre coasts. Men who had been fishing since their teens and who had, in the autumn of 1941 or 1942 or 1943, been asked if they were willing to make a crossing to Shetland with a cargo they were told about, and a return trip they understood the risks of, and who had said yes. Most of them made multiple crossings before the sea, or the Germans took them. Most of them are buried, when they are buried at all, in the North Sea, which is the occupational graveyard of the men who fish it, and which kept them, as it keeps all the men it takes, without ceremony and without acknowledgement, in the water that they had been crossing since before the war began. What the German documents say about them, in the aggregate of the files that accumulated over 4 years of failed interdiction, is less than what they deserve, and more revealing than the Germans intended. The reports describe vessels and cargoes and departures and absences. They describe a phenomenon that cannot be stopped, and a route that cannot be closed, and a network that cannot be penetrated. They describe, in the accumulated evidence of their own institutional failure, an operation conducted by men who knew the sea better than the institution trying to stop them, and who used that knowledge in the service of a country that needed it. The German documents do not describe courage, because courage is not a category in the vocabulary of security reports. But the courage is present in the record, in the gap between what the German security apparatus brought to the problem and what it achieved, in the 136 departures from Norwegian waters that the records show, and the vessels that, departing, were never seen again by the people filing the reports. Gone to Shetland. Carrying the cargo. Coming back. If this story hit you, like and subscribe. Here is the question that stays with you after the Shetland Bus. The operation succeeded because it was invisible, because it looked exactly like what it was pretending to be. Ordinary Norwegian fishermen doing ordinary Norwegian things. But invisibility of that kind requires a community that refuses, completely and without exception, to cooperate with the occupying power. How do you build that?